All right, we are trying to do this abortion series, which is interesting in that we started this a couple weeks ago and this whole Roe v. Wade thing happened. So it's good that interest is sparked on this discussion, that there's debate going on and arguments going on, because I think the truth will prevail to anyone that is reasonable. I have a good friend of mine who had someone said something about abortion and they tried to respond, and the other person said, I don't want to debate. I don't want to talk about it. And to be honest, I wouldn't either on the other side, because it's difficult to hold that position, especially with the Christian worldview. But it is something that's good for us to think about and talk about. So what we've been trying to do here is give shorter, sort of more bite-sized versions of the key parts of this discussion. And last week we looked at all the verses that are relevant to the topic. Basically all the verses that are relevant to the topic. If you haven't seen that one, I think it's a good one to watch. I didn't do much arguing or editorializing, just sort of laid out the verses that are relevant. And we're going to go back and look at some of the big ones in the videos to come. This one is on the most controversial verse, as it is used by both sides to argue their point. And that is Exodus chapter 21, verse 22 through 25. What we have in this passage is two men who are fighting, and in their struggle accidentally hit a woman who is pregnant. And then that woman either miscarries or gives premature birth to a child. And then we have a penalty for if there's no harm and if there is harm. If there's no harm, there is a fine. If there is harm, then life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Okay? When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Now, one of the reasons this verse is difficult is because the Hebrew is a bit ambiguous here about who exactly the harm is to. And so the pro-choice side tends to say the harm there is in reference to the mother and not the child. And they'll say that what's being talked about here when it says her children come out, that's miscarriage. And the pro-life side says the harm is to both the mother and the child, or perhaps even just the child. But generally, the pro-life side says harm is being referred to here as the mother or the child who comes out. Okay, so the big significance of this passage is the pro-choice side says if it is harm to the mother, and that what's being referred to here is miscarriage, then all that's required for miscarriage is a fine. But if harm is done to the mother, the post-birth human, then that is required life for life, tooth for tooth, eye for eye, etc. Okay, so they'll say, well, that when a miscarriage occurs, the fine, it's just a fine. When harm to an adult human occurs, it's life for life. So the punishments are different. So therefore, the value should be seen as different, right? So the person in the womb is not as valuable as the person outside of the womb, because the person in the womb just requires a fine if there's harm to it. The person outside of the womb requires life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc. Okay, so the pro-choice side says we have a clear distinction here in Exodus 21 that fetuses are less valuable than those who are outside of the womb. Okay, less valuable as seen by that punishment. And it all focuses on the idea of who was harmed and this idea of the children coming out. Okay, now I try to pride myself on not strawmanning the other side and not overstating our case, my case, whatever the case is. What I want to do here is give you 4 reasons that I think it's unlikely, very unlikely, even implausible, that this passage is referring to miscarriage and a difference in value between the fetus and the mother. That is 4 reasons why I think the pro-life interpretation of this passage is the correct one. And the pro-life one is simply that it's what's being referred to is if there's harm to either the child who is born prematurely or the mother, that there's a fine paid if there's no harm because it was a threat of harm. And if there is harm to either one of them, then eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. Okay, 4 reasons. Firstly is this. There are 2 Hebrew words for miscarry, and neither one is used here. There are 2 Hebrew words for miscarry, and neither one is used here. This is the word that is used other places in Scripture to mean premature birth or being born, just coming out of the womb. The word literally means come out. And it's a word that is used in the Hebrew Bible not to refer to miscarriage, but to refer to birth and sometimes to premature birth. You can look at Genesis 25:26, 38:29, and Jeremiah 1:5 to that end to see those times where that word is used to mean birth. So this word does not mean miscarry. So if the author intended to communicate miscarriage, he could have done so easily by just using one of the two words in Hebrew for miscarriage, but he did not choose to use that word. So the question is, where do they get the idea of miscarriage from? Well, the primary argument for this comes from actually the Code of Hammurabi. It's a code you probably know about if you went to school, if you learned things, which is a very prominent moral law code from the ancient times that is coinciding with the Old Testament as it's being written. And so scholars will say, well, all this is a copy of Hammurabi's code. In Hammurabi's code, if a woman miscarries, then there is a fine charged to the person who causes the miscarriage. If a woman is hit and miscarries, then a fine is charged. So it's very similar to what's being said here, right? But it is a fine being charged for a miscarriage. And then if the woman is harmed herself, then it's life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And so the scholars say, well, really all that's happening here is a parallel being drawn. It's the same thing as Hammurabi's code, which was relevant to the time period. But the problem is, of course, for the Christian, especially, that the Bible is often very different than the cultural things of the time. And there's nothing in the text itself here that says miscarriage. There's nothing in the text itself that would lead you to the conclusion of miscarriage. So in order to say that what's meant here is miscarriage, you have to go outside of the text entirely and say, actually, we should trust that it's a parallel to Hammurabi's code, even though there's no reason to think that it is, at least from the text itself. The text itself says if the children are born, the children come out. It shouldn't be surprising that the Bible has a different value for the fetus than those outside of Christianity or those outside of the faith, outside of the way, outside of Israel and Israel's faith at the time. So we shouldn't use a non-Israelite outside source to trump the words themselves that are here in the text. And the words themselves say if the children are born, if the child is born or born prematurely. So when men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, so that her children are born prematurely, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined. So it seems, reason number 2, that the plain reading is harm to both. It is indeed. If you were to just read that passage without presuppositions, you would come to the conclusion, probably, it seems to me at least, that the harm would be done to both. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall be fined. No harm to who? To the subjects of the sentence, to the ones he was just talking about, to the woman and the children who have now been born. So if two men struggle together and hit a woman and her children come out, her children are born, but there is no harm to either one, then there is a fine charged to against the one who caused the children to be born, children to come out. If there is harm, that is to either the mother or the child who has now come out, then there will be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc. Okay? So reason number 1 is that the words here don't mean miscarry. The words mean born. Reason number 2, the plain reading is harm to both of those whom he has just referenced, and not to jump back to the first subject and ignore the second. Thirdly, if it is one or the other, it's probably the fetus that's being referred to. Right? So if there's only harm being done to one or the other, it's probably the fetus that's in mind and not the mother. Right? Here's what I mean. Hitting a pregnant woman seems to, by nature, cause harm to the pregnant woman. You hit her, right? And you hit her so hard that it caused birth, or it caused miscarriage, if you want to hold that translation. You hit her so hard that it caused that thing. That seems harmful, right? It seems like there's already been harm to the mother. So to say when men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, even though there's already been harm to the mother by being hit, it would seem that the harm then is in reference to the child. Now, I don't hold that view, really. I think it's probably harm to both. But I think if you're going to pick one or the other, the more reasonable explanation, the more reasonable source of the harm, or the one who is harmed, is the child and not the mother, because the mother has already been harmed by being hit to the point that she would give birth. So it could be that they're saying, if you hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there's no harm to the child, even though there's already been harm to the mother, then you'll be fined for the threat of harm to the child. All right. Number 4. Even if it were miscarriage, okay? Even if the translation was miscarriage, what I think is impossible to come to just by reading the text. Even if the translation should be miscarry, and what the idea here is that the woman lost the child and therefore the harm is just to the mother. Even if just a fine is required for the fetus, there's still a fine required for the fetus. Right? This is kind of the clincher in my mind. Even if miscarriage is in view and the harm is only in reference to the mother, there's still a fine that caused the miscarriage. That is, the loss of the fetus still required a penalty. So, if the accidental harm, the accidental killing of an unborn child, of a fetus, requires a fine, requires a penalty, then surely there should be a penalty for the purposeful killing of one. Right? Right. So, even if you want to argue that it's miscarriage, and even if you want to hold on to the argument that the fetus is less valuable in some sense than the adult mother, still, we have rightful punishment given for the accidental killing of that child. Therefore, surely there is punishment to be owed to one who purposely kills that child. That there is moral weight to that action, that action is wrong. Even if it is less wrong than harming the mother, it is still wrong. Because that child does hold some value. Okay, so I think the plain reading of the text is the true one. I think what's happening here is these two men are fighting. They hit this woman. If the child comes out and there's no harm to the mother or the child, then they are fined for the threat of harm to the mother or the child. If there is harm to the mother or the child, then it should be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So here's what this means. Okay, if the premature child requires the same penalty as the post-birth mother, as an adult human, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, which I think is the honest and proper interpretation of this passage, then what you have is indeed the pro-life argument that says there is absolute and equal human value, human personhood, humanity on the fetus in utero, in the womb, as there is after that child is born, even after that child becomes an adult, that it is human, that it is alive, that it is fully valuable, and to take its life is the same as to take the life of a human adult, and therefore it's wrong. That's what I think is the proper interpretation of the verse, and I think even if you interpret it otherwise, even if you interpret it as miscarriage, apart from the text, and just pull in Hammurabi's code entirely arbitrarily, you still have value placed on the fetus to the point that causes penalty for an accidental killing of it. Okay, I think that's good. Love you guys. Talk to you soon.